Well, good evening, Cedar Falls, and welcome to the Standing Committee meeting of Monday, May 1st, 2023. I will now call this meeting to order with a roll call from Madam Clerk.
Schultz.
Here.
DeBoer. Here. Cruz.
Here.
Harding.
Here.
Ganfield.
Here.
Sayers.
Here.
Dunn. Here. All members present.
Thank you. All right, we are in the Community Development Committee tonight, and we are going to see a presentation on the Housing Needs Assessment Report. And I believe we have Executive Director Jim Brown from the Cedar Falls Economic Development Corporation, as well as Brian Schoen. Are you up first, Mr. Brown?
Yep, it is.
All right.
Yep, thank
Well,
you.
we'll hand it right over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, City Council and staff. We appreciate the opportunity to just give an introduction here, but obviously Brian with Intercog to give some ins and outs of the housing need assessment. As a brief refresher, the CFEDC started in July of 2021. It was very well received, and by the end of the year, up into 2022, we had stopped at 22 board members. From that point of view, then we created a healthy public-private partnership with the city for some funding there as well. And so going into 2022, it wasn't difficult to see that Cedar Falls had some issues with housing. We would see even ancillarily times like early 2022 and into the entire year, if there was a home for sale, we'd have multiple, if not dozens, of offers on that house, and the price would go through the roof. So just even driving around and just paying attention to it, we knew there was some issues with the housing. So our board of directors approved a housing need assessment, as of course it relates also to our mission, which is economic development. So we hired Intercog, who also worked with IDM from the University of Northern Iowa, with funding from, in part, our investors and in part the city. And what you'll hear tonight is the what, how, and the why for a housing need assessment. You'll hear about the timelines, task forces, committees, and focus groups, just really the process involved to generate that awareness and input for a final document, and ultimately confirm the need for the housing options. And this document is official. It's recognized by many stakeholders and locally around the state and even development around the state. And as for many, it's the starting point for economic development. In saying that, I'll leave you with something Bob Seymour put together during our public relation campaign the last month. Bob, of course, worked for the city for 30 years, but he mentioned it this way: Cedar Falls' success has been historically tied to manufacturing, industrial, and technology growth. That continued job growth requires additional local employees. New employees to Cedar Falls require the options for various housing. The additional housing creates stable and a growing tax base. You folks just went through that with your search for revenue during your budget approval process. That stable tax base provides affordable tax rates along with amenities desired by new and existing community members. Of course, Bob mentioned, or he finished it. Now the goal is, let's repeat that process over and over and over. Let's look for that kind of growth. With that, I'll turn things over to Brian Schoen from Intercog. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Good evening. Appreciate the opportunity to be in front of the council tonight and give you an update on where we're at. And I know that the draft as well as the PowerPoint went out ahead of time, and then there was a leave behind as well, just a two-page summary that covers what it is that we did in a year's time. We started just about a year ago, and we're just getting to the final throes of things. And with that being said, we'll just go ahead and I'll just walk through slides. We'll cover a lot of the handout. We'll cover a lot of the document. The document is very lengthy. The chief author is right there. That's Rose Phillips. She was the one responsible for assembling the document and making it make sense. It's about 125 pages long, and there's a couple of appendices, one of which is very long, but it has that community survey that we did. So it has a summary report about the survey that was done by IDM. And again, the partners, as mentioned by Jim, certainly CFEDC, the city, your staff played a significant role in the process as well too, attending meetings, as a couple council members were invited as well too to attend those meetings. So what you've got is the culmination of a 1 year. Couple of things I want to remind you of. This is a housing plan only. It is intended to be citywide. It's not intended to be attached to a specific project. So there may be projects that come to you as the city council, whether it be for assistance, whether it be for tax credit help, whatever it is. Again, this plan is intended to be a general document whereby those developers and those persons requesting assistance would have to make sure that they're consistent with the plan. So we'll go ahead and just walk down through the slides. We talked a little bit about public input and why it's important, why the housing needs assessment is important. It's really just an exploratory document. It's not drilled down to the specific project. It doesn't say anything from the standpoint of here's the budget and here's when it's going to take this long and here are the sub steps. It's intended to be a general project whereby either the council, your staff, CFEDC, or any other entity that is active in the community can pick it up then and use the document to help support the projects that they may be interested in. So again, we talked to a number of elected officials, developers, employers, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but the purpose of it is really self-explanatory: housing needs assessment. So what are the needs in the community in terms of housing and just specific to housing? And so we're looking for gaps. We're looking for pricing ranges that we don't have a lot of inventory for. We're looking for those things that we think we knew starting this process, and in some cases it validates what we knew on the front end, and in some cases it may debunk some of the things that we found during the process as well too. So again, we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, I mentioned the programs that are out there. Again, workforce housing tax credits not being the only program, but certainly the program that is most proximate. The due date for those applications, I think, is in June. So the process was very deliberate in terms of being public. There were a number of different things that we started with. We started with a steering committee, which was just a handful of folks from CFEDC, from the city, from Intercog, and from IDM, and we just kind of set the tenor for everything. And so, again, very public process. We then created a task force, which is a larger, about 24 member group that we bounced things off of, sent things to and from. But that wasn't the only thing we did. We actually went out and conducted focus groups with specific employers and specific bodies, specific employees, or specific employers during the process. So we sat down with a number of different groups, tail end of August across 3 days, and gave them basically predetermined questions that we were interested in their comments, and one of which that is very interesting was we were asking about how far do people commute to work in the community, and how far do people commute from Cedar Falls outside of the community. And so we were able to work with the employers and get a pretty good handle. And that's actually one of those things that I would say was a little bit of a surprise to us, that there were folks that were working in the community that are traveling multiple counties, either to work here or vice versa. They're coming in from that particular county or leaving at the end of the day. Committees, we also had the commissions that we met with. We met with your Human Rights Commission. We met with your Housing Commission. As part of the process, actually, we were back every month with the Housing Commission, kind of feeding them pieces and parts, because as you might imagine, this is something that feeds into their planning process for those community development block grant and home funds. And so, again, the commissions and the committees were a big part of it. We then did do a survey. Of course, we had the TV show that was televised, and a number of other different things. But if you haven't had a chance to go through the draft of the document, and I know it's lengthy, but it is chock full of data. There is all kinds of data. The data is actually fairly new. We were fortunate enough to be granted access to multiple listings information. So we had pretty real-time information in terms of sales for homes and those kinds of things. So by no stretch of the imagination were we relying on data that was 10 years old or something beyond that. So here's the groups, the steering committee, just a small group, just to give a direction. And then the task force is really our sounding board. So here's the timeline that we started all this. So we started, again, as I said before, just about a year ago, and had a number of meetings across this year, meeting with the various groups, bringing things back and forth, sharing, rewriting, redoing, those kinds of things. So as you might imagine, it's a pretty typical planning process. As we get better information, new information, we've adjusted the document accordingly. And that leads us to tonight, which is May 1st in this presentation. And then tomorrow evening at the community center, we will be doing a community reflection meeting between the hours of 4 and 6. It will be open to the public. It's just going to be big boards. So it's going to be cut to the quick kind of thing, not all 125 pages. It's just going to be kind of the cliff notes for the overall doc, but we're interested in hearing what the public says about some of the recommendations and some of the things we're thinking about and talking about with the community. So that will be tomorrow night, and then obviously we're hoping to be back in front of you in 2 weeks on May 15th. With the idea being that the council would take up the plan formally for adoption such that it's on record then with the state in terms of having an approved housing needs assessment. So as entities look for funds, then we're on record with that doc. So again, we'll be back in 2 weeks hopefully and have an opportunity to answer any questions tonight, but also then too. So the focus groups that we met with, and again, these were small focus groups, and we looked at and talked with employers, senior housing, of course, builders, developers, financial folks, real estate professionals, some of the human service providers that are in the community. And so we had a number of good questions that we got answered, but it gave us, from their perspective, a feel for what it is like in terms of the housing market in the community today. And so, and we all know that's changing pretty quickly as interest rates adjust and so on and so forth. So again, survey process that we did, it was online. We got some 144 responses back. 10 of them were paper and the other ones were all online. Again, one of your appendices in the doc, when everything gets back to you, will cover a summary of that particular survey so you can go through and read then what the public had said in terms of housing. Again, we were very limited on our questions, again, just focusing on housing. Again, respondents throughout the community, a decent cross-section of the community. And then the one thing, as you might imagine, the affordability of the housing can be a challenge. So this is just a summary of some of the responses coming back in those 144 surveys. And you can see that on the left end, the most frequent things that we ran into in terms of response was pricing and availability were two things right at the top. And then interestingly enough, taxes was on the other end. So one of those things that you kind of pay attention to, but that's what we got back from the surveys themselves. Those were the outreach pieces. Again, Channel 15, civic organizations, home builders had a session here at Bienvenue that was attended, I think, by some of the CFEDC and some of the city staff, just from a home builder's perspective, and then a spot on KWWL on that Ron Steele on the Sunday morning. So number of different ways that we went out and talked to people. So what jumped out at us? Sale prices have increased by 1/4 in the last 5 years. Probably no surprise, that's going on in a lot of places, but just know that the price has climbed fairly significantly. The interesting part of that, from a law of supply and demand, is that houses available for sale, and we looked at 5 years, so we went mid-December of 2016 to mid-December of 2022, and you went from some 150, 160 units being available to just between 40 and 45 in middle of December. So a large dent, if you will, in the available units in terms of being available for folks. We got updates every time we met on how many units were available, and it was interesting in terms of how many units. Not uncommon for the number to be very small in terms of available units in the community. Again, probably not a surprise entirely to you either. Median price is sitting right at about $225,000. That climbs for the new homes then. So the homes that were built in 21 and 22, there's your range for median between 420 and 476. So very, very expensive. The interesting thing that shows up is that 79%, so occupied homes were greater than 250,000 were 70%. So nearly 80% of the homes that were available were over $250,000. So what that means is there's probably a short supply on anything that's considered affordable or reasonably priced. The lots, one of the things that we had heard repeatedly was the lack of lots. And you have processed a number of subdivisions. We know we've been watching the subdivisions go through, but in terms of lots being available for the public to purchase or for a developer to do a one-off home is very challenging in terms of getting a lot or purchasing a lot, and those lots are very pricey. So again, probably not a surprise to you. Again, the chart gives you an idea where the active units were, and then by price range you can see that as well too. And I'll just run through that. So here's the chart that I told you across 5 years in terms of available units. From the high 5 years ago, mid-December of 16, from about 150 down to about 40, 45 in that neck of the woods in terms of being available. So the line chart there is fairly obvious in terms of available units for sale in the community. So a couple of other things that just want to run through with you is, again, we talked about affordability. We talked about some of those homes perhaps being out of reach, $420,000 to $476,000. Some of those prices, again, fairly high price. What we did then was we looked at then the median wage for persons performing certain employment tasks in the community, and then just determine what they could afford in terms of how much of their check would go towards housing. And we did that for home ownership, and we did that for renter. So again, what you'll see is a couple of charts. In Iowa and in Cedar Falls, a significant amount of the housing stock is pre-1940. So it's got some date to it. What you see there with the green line shows you, okay, what's the average for a home built in that year? And then you can see the various occupations and the affordability in terms of that older home. Can they afford that when they're working that particular job? And then likewise, the purple bar on the outer right is any and all housing in the community. So you get an idea for the housing units and then the overall community. And then here's the rent. Again, same thing with the rent. What we did was we looked at affordability of rent. Again, there's a significant percentage that's over $750 a month in terms of paying cash rent. And then as an employee, can you, setting limits and making assumptions that you expend a certain percentage of your income on housing, can you afford then the rent that's being asked is the question then. Okay, so again, retirement housing, again, we don't probably have to talk to you about that between Western Home and New Aldea and the other senior housing that is available in the community, which is a very unique trait for the city of Cedar Falls. Not a lot of the communities we work in. I work in a 6-county area and have contacts throughout the state, and we don't have a lot of circumstances or situations as fortunate as yours with regard to senior housing. But it is pricey. And so, again, you can take a look at some of the statistical information. Again, we're falling behind to a degree. If you look at it, there's 674 low and moderate income, which is considered 80% of area median, which is the county. And we're just ticking off a handful of rehabs every year with the block grant. So, again, we're working hard at trying to keep up, but knowing that we're not keeping up is really the message. So what else stood out? Affordable housing is something that has come up in all the conversations that is lacking. The stakeholders, what we did was we were asked by the task force to look at other communities and look at some of the other tools, look at some of the other policies, look at some of the other ways that they're dealing with housing, particularly if they are considered a progressive community with regard to housing. And so we took a look at that again in the plan, starting way at the back, about on page 114. There are very detailed actions that are in the back in a table. You'll see that we tentatively assigned some of those responsibilities to persons or individuals or bodies that it made the most sense to assign them to. And so you can take a look at those as well, but it'll give you a lot more detail in terms of what we're thinking. But long story short is, as we've done calculations, we're showing that in order to stay even, if growth continues historically like it has been, that it's about 110 units per year. So 700 units over the course of the next 7 years to 2030, and then about 1,100 units between 2030 and 2040. And our understanding is that's in the ballpark with what you're doing now anyway. So it's not completely out of place that those 100 units a year wouldn't be misstated. So some of the strategies, and I'll run through these relatively quickly. What we should tell you is that the strategies are advisory only. Again, you will see language in there that says consider, it says research, it says study, it says do those kinds of things, with the idea being that this document is the starting point, and then from there drill down on a project a little further, and that's when it becomes this is what we're going to do kind of a situation. So again, not binding, they're advisory only. And then again, some of the common themes that we picked up on is that communities that are progressive with regard to housing are looking at a number of different housing sources financially. It's not just one source or another, it's multiple sources. And then typically there's usually broad-based support for whatever the community is doing with regard to housing. And so those two things are kind of the keys to success in terms of housing from what we've seen. So I'm just going to run through the different categories and the different groups. These categories and groups were established pretty quick. We had lists that we were working with task force, we were working with the focus groups, and we had the surveys. And so in November, December, we started identifying how do some of these activities and action steps fit together, under what categories do they fit, and what should be some of the things that we should look at in terms of a community, in terms of improving our situation with regard to housing however we can. So again, the regulatory piece always comes up, and the question then becomes, does the city do a self-examination of the requirements that the city has with regard to housing, and does it look at making some adjustments to those particular regulations? Some of the regulations may be dated. I know that you've spent a considerable amount of time on the downtown zoning in the midst of the project we've been working on, and what we're saying is that an out-and-out review of those regulations is not a bad idea. And so you may be throwing out the baby with the bathwater if you're doing certain things that are in fact defeating your purposes. So some of the timelines, again, along with the regulations, is how long does it take to get a development through the community? If I walk in the door, I'm a developer, how long is that process? Is that process too long, too short? Is it consistent? And we're just saying that everybody can improve, and we would hope that in part of that examination that would be done as well too. So a mix of housing units, mix of different types, as you might imagine. The stakeholders, again, that would be part of this. So one of the things that came up is in a couple of other communities, there is a non-binding but yet can provide some loose recommendations, both, and this is both in Waterloo and in Cedar Rapids, that there is this thing called like a developers council that gives an opportunity for staff and for developers to sit down and work through, vet some of the regulations, especially the new regulations that may be coming up, so that people know what the impact is. So the developer knows the impact, but also so you as council and your staff know what that impact is as well. So this concept of a committee, call it whatever you like. It can be a forum, it can be a committee, it could be a council, it could be whatever, but it's just intended to provide access between staff and those developers on a regular basis. So there's no surprises, I guess, is in the end what we're hoping for. Again, modifying some of those ordinances if and when we can to shorten some of those up. If there is any possibility of doing some universal design on things, that would be fine as well. Not unlike probably your building codes to a degree. And then, so that's the regulatory piece. Then there are the financial mechanisms. And again, these are financial tools. We would ask you to take a look at them, but make the decision for your community. We would ask you to be prudent about which policies and procedures you look at. Some of these policies and procedures from time to time have gotten carried away, and so we don't want to leave the city in a strapped financial condition or situation. So the first thing that is out there is low-hanging fruit, and that's the local housing trust fund. The city of Cedar Falls is not in a trust fund right now, does not have a trust fund. This is a source of affordable housing dollars that comes from the state legislature and is allocated to some 26 or 27 local housing trust funds. And it's something then that the city could look at to help push your dollars out a little bit further in terms of those block grant dollars and home dollars. TIF, tax increment finance, is something that a number of our communities look at. TIF operates a little bit differently than it does for industries and businesses. It's got a shorter time frame. There are specific requirements that you have to meet, but we think it's something that should be taken a look at. Tax abatement, same thing. If there's an opportunity to abate taxes, that is one that a number of communities are working on right now in our region. They're abating taxes. Again, our caution is don't abate too much. You've got to be prudent about how you do this so that you're not putting stress on the general fund. So you're not giving away everything. You're giving away what you can afford to give away. And so obviously there's some study that needs to go into that as well too. And then one of the other things we talked about was looking at some of the fees that the city charges. We know you've equalized your building permit fees with the city of Waterloo, and you're to be applauded for that. Just keeps you kind of on a level playing field. But we're saying looking at some of the fees and those kinds of things might be a decent use of time. So some of the other things that we've jumped on is from a financial standpoint is looking at then amending the ordinances. We talked about that before. Impact fees is a tool that Not available in the state of Iowa yet, but at some point in time it may. What it does is it assesses a fee back to development to help offset the cost of certain things like sewer plant, water tower, schools, and those kinds of things. Again, no enabling legislation in Iowa yet, but that doesn't mean we're not heading there at some point in time. And so that's a locally adopted fee and considered a tax. So now you know why there is an enabling legislation, because you know, giving that power, granting that power is something that the legislature does not take lightly. So a few others. So in the program mix items, we know that the city is going to be working on their consolidated plan, which is tied to those CDBG dollars and home dollars coming up. So we took care of some of the questions and took care of some of that during the survey work and in some of the focus groups, and so we would have a head start then on that overall plan. So we don't have to hopefully go back and redouble our efforts in terms of doing the appropriate planning. So one of the things we talked about was a risk mitigation fund for developers, for landlords who are willing to accept housing choice vouchers. Again, we're talking about a mixture of units. We're talking about streamlining the processes if we can. Again, pretty tough with community development block grant to streamline that process, but one of the things we talked about is maybe there's another way that we can fund that. And so, again, we talked about just opportunities to work more closely with the City of Waterloo. You're in a consortium with them for those home funds, and there's always an opportunity to work back and forth with the community, and it ensures that those dollars then come forward. Again, whatever you can do to reduce the barriers is something that we would suggest. And again, that cautionary note at the bottom is the one that I've brought up a number of times, and that is make sure that you're doing the calculations, make sure you've done your due diligence before you start handing out incentives that hopefully you may not be able to carry. And so we want to make sure that you can carry it. Use of space, we talked about a number of things with regard to land use. Certainly we talked about annexation is something that you're familiar with as a city council. You've done this for business and industries in the past. We also talked about developers that come in, if there is a percentage of lots that could be dedicated to affordable housing within the subdivision, then that might be something you incent. If they don't, then you don't incent it. So it's a real simple concept there. We talked a lot about gray fields, which is adaptive reuse, reusing property within the community for housing purposes. Infill development, adaptive reuse of buildings, all of those kinds of things were part of the conversation. And then also then conveying any city properties potentially to developers at some point in time. If the city is not going to develop it and you want it back on the tax rolls, then that might be something you take a look at. Upper Story is a program state of Iowa has gotten very active in from a housing perspective. Putting in upper story rental properties, not unlike what you have on Main Street. You have a number of those downtown, and we're saying that concept is something that is probably desirable for folks. Again, we want to make sure that if we can geographically distribute the housing in the community in terms of the different uses and the different types, that would be it would be advantageous for us to do that. And the last comment that we made was, again, state legislature is actually working on this now, land banks legislation, which is an opportunity for nonprofit organization to take possession of property and then sell it and have it redeveloped. Again, the idea is to put the property back on the tax rolls. And that is actually a bill that is moving in the legislature. And as quick as they change things, I haven't caught it lately, but it was hanging in. It met all the funnels, and so far so good. So some of the other things that jumped out at us that we would call other impediments to housing costs and things that eat into housing costs for folks are things that you probably have heard before as well. First and foremost, transportation costs, childcare costs, all those are very expensive, and those do eat into the affordability of the unit for the individual. And so that is something that has come up as well as a target project. Again, it's a huge project, and so either of them are huge projects. But again, the group said we need to start looking at doing this. And then the other thing is as you invite in business and industries either to your community or to expand in your community, to look at those wages and the benefits that they pay and making sure that it's something that adequately they can afford to live in Cedar Falls rather than having to travel somewhere else or something like that. So again, and then the last thing is the placemaking piece. And that was something that the city of Cedar Falls, city of Waterloo, greater Cedar Valley was working on with Intercog in terms of the river is kind of the common ribbon. And so we were working on projects for placemaking. We were identifying what attractions in it and so on and so forth. Again, that's a little bit more commercial and industrial than the housing report, but it is something that we did talk about in terms of placemaking. So the last thing is a reminder. We are meeting with the public tomorrow, 4 to 6 at the community center. There'll be big boards and an opportunity for people to ask questions and I guess tell us, square us around if we miss something or add things. And so it's just an opportunity for us to ask questions and of the public, then they can come in on their own time. They don't have to worry about coming to a meeting. If they're bashful and don't like to speak in public or whatever it is, it'll give them an opportunity then to basically go to the stations and each one of the areas, so regulatory and all those categories will have stations. And so if you're interested in that, then you can head that direction, or if you're interested in some of the other things, you can go to one of the other stations. So that is it. Did I miss anything? Again, do thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your time. It's a lot to digest. It's been a long process, as you might imagine. The document is chock full of data. There's a lot of very interesting data in there. Again, very current data. And we hope that we'll be invited back in the middle of the month and you'll have an opportunity to decide on adopting the plan and moving it forward.
Thank you, Brian. I'll open it up real quick to council to ask any questions. Councilmember Schultz.
Brian Gil Schultz, first off, I commend you on I think you went through that entire thing without a single So Sharon Juan would be very proud of you.
Okay.
Right? And I have a couple questions.
Sure.
I did, as you said, that there's a very long document, and I believe it's in the 60s or the 70s page numbers. And you made a mention tonight about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Could you clarify what you mean by modifying ordinances or clarifying what we're doing with ordinances?
Right. So the city council has updated a piece of the ordinance in the downtown area. And so it modernized it. It moved things in a direction that allows mixed uses. Zoning historically separates uses. That's what it was developed for. And so one of the things that we talked about or that we were hoping to implore was that we would look at mixing uses if appropriate, that we would look at updating definitions, those kinds of things in the document, but we're saying it's a walkthrough of the overall ordinance and doesn't mean you end up where you were at. I know that some of you got a little bit of pushback on the downtown ordinance at times, but we actually heard positive things from our developers group. So, you know, it kind of depends on who you talk to, I suppose, sometimes, but we're just saying it's time to go through and modernize some of the other pieces, whether it be as simple as definitions or as simple as setback requirements, lot size requirements, tying affordability back to approvals or incentives, just doing some of those kinds of things.
So just for clarification, and some questions that are asked are rhetorical, and also they're asked from council because not everyone that we represent has the opportunity to review these and
Right.
such. So from a standpoint of form-based zoning, are developers happy with what we did downtown, or do they want action to repeal it or modify it, or what's your statement on that?
My statement was based on what we found when we talked to the developers in that small focus group was not about repealing it. It was that it actually did some modernization of the ordinance. It allows some of the mixing of uses. It does some of those things that, again, run a little contrary to zoning. And so we didn't have anybody come in and say repeal this or throw it out or we want it gone or anything like that. I think the general consensus was that it needed some time to, get used to it so that people, it won't happen overnight. And so it's kind of like the roundabouts in the community. It took a long time for people to get used to that, and this is really no different.
Was there some pushback on roundabouts?
No. We're not doing anything on there.
I'll just ask a couple more questions,
Sure.
and I'll stop here. You mentioned upper dwellings. Did I miss talking about the ADUs, the accessory dwelling units? Is that something that was discussed, or?
Yep. Also, toward the back in that, about on page 114, in the recommendations, was a list of things that the city would look at, and ADUs would be one of the things to look at. Doesn't mean it's absolutely going to happen, but it is an option or an alternative for the city to look at in terms of affordability.
And then lastly, from affordability, you mentioned that the people that were commuting, was there a follow-up question on that, if it was financial or personal choice to live in a community they maybe grew up in? Or
Yeah, we didn't follow up with why, and could be telecommuting as well too. We've all learned how to do that with the pandemic, but the thing that was amazing to me is, and there's a table in the plan that tells you by county where in-commuters are coming to Cedar Falls and then where the Cedar Falls folks are out commuting in terms of employment. And it was a surprise to us that Dubuque County, Lynn County, Polk County, that there were a number of counties that are a significant distance, that people are either traveling or they're traveling back and forth, but that's where the paycheck is getting mailed, I guess is the way we looked at it. And so without divulging information from the employers, we just ask them, what's the address on the paycheck? Where's the paycheck going?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other council members have questions?
Councilman Harding?
Yes.
I
Councilmember Dunn.
I just want to clarify, for tomorrow night's event, is that an open house format or?
Yeah.
Okay, so folks can get off at 4:30 and still come down and learn and?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
I think your staff set up the time frame. We have it till 4 till 8, I think, but we're going to be there till 6.
Okay.
So is what we kind of thought.
Okay,
So
thank you.
Councilmember DeBur?
In your financial mechanisms, I heard you mention something about offering tax abatements in some neighborhoods, but not all neighborhoods, and obviously not in a TIF district. Are there legal ramifications of not offering it to everyone?
I don't know that there are legal ramifications. A lot of our communities will offer it in just certain areas where they want to incent either redevelopment or major development, and so they will actually identify a district, not unlike you do with TIF, where you identify a district and pass the ordinance that says, in this district, we will abate taxes, and they set up a sliding scale typically. And residential is governed pretty heavily by the state of Iowa, but we've not had anybody push back from a legal standpoint in terms of offering it for one and not offering it for another. Doesn't mean that there aren't comments. It doesn't mean that the council can't adjust the district, and most of those districts stay in place for about 3 to 5 years. So it comes back to the council fairly regularly in terms of tweaking or moving those boundaries.
Well, what about the use of, you also mentioned using the TIF money, even though it's not in a TIF district. What ramifications does that have?
So TIF for housing specifically, again, separate section within the code, only allows you a 10-year life for the TIF district. And then one of the things that's unique for housing in TIF is that you have to set aside, if it's market rate housing that you're doing in the particular development, you have to set aside X number of dollars, which is equivalent to the percentage of low and moderate income households in the county in which the city is located. So the city, if it did market housing only, would have to set aside dollars. Those dollars then, those TIF dollars, then the stipulation is they have to go towards affordable or LMI type projects. So you have to spend those dollars then just on those projects. So it's going to force you to look at being probably a little bit more picky and a little bit more choosy. But we have communities that are doing their repair and their rehab projects out of those funds rather than federal funds or state funds, because they're their funds. They're the local government's funds.
So you're really talking about setting up a funding source that's not current in the budget and having to fund that source.
Yeah.
Other questions? All right, I would ask staff, would you like a motion to move this forward to be considered by council so we know where we stand? That way.
I mean, that would be helpful, but typically with plans that we do, we give a presentation like this at committee,
Yeah.
and then we do put it on the next agenda. So that's what we were anticipating doing.
All right, so there's no motion needed if it's just going to be on there. So we know it's going to be on there. If there's any other comments, well, Brian, thank you so much for your time, all that information. I've spent some time reading through it, and I was surprised at many of the data points. So I'm going to continue digesting it before the next meeting. And thanks to Jim Brown as well in the CD. I'm going to get an acronym I'm going to get it wrong. I gotta look at it. The Cedar Falls.
EDC.
Yeah, that one. I'm just going off of it.
Yeah, and do need to recognize IDM, the University of Northern Iowa, a great partner with us as well too. They did a lot of the data and a lot of the engagement type meetings. So we're fortunate to be able to turn that over to them. That's their strong suit.
And thanks too to Rose.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rose.
Absolutely. She's a lot of work in that, document. So in the meantime, if you have questions, if you would work through staff, if you got anything that as you're looking through the document, or I said something wrong or said something that doesn't make sense, or you had a question or you want further clarification, then just let your staff know and we'll get addressed back to you.
All right. Well, we appreciate that. And seeing that the time is about 10 till, I will now adjourn this meeting, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for the city council meeting. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.